Okay, so before I became Joe Biden's press secretary 4 years ago, I oversaw the confirmations team for the Biden-Harris transition. So let me just give you a sense of how this process is actually supposed to work. Potential nominees, even before the president makes a final decision, he may have people in his mind, but even before he makes a final decision, go through a rigorous vetting process that tears through every aspect of their lives and their finances. It is grueling, and anyone who's been through it will tell you it's very invasive. Sometimes things that wouldn't even be a blip in a normal hiring process blow up the nomination before it even begins. Sometimes those things seem small, like taking weed gummies to sleep better or paying some taxes late. Sometimes they seem bigger, like when some client that some nominee once worked with has business before the government. But there is a reason the process is so grueling under Democrats and Republicans. It's because you want people who don't have conflicts of interest, who won't become a distraction because of controversy, representing the public interest and advising the president. And then for national security nominees, there is typically even greater scrutiny because any skeletons, like, say, an unreported personal scandal, can be seen as vulnerabilities that could be used by a foreign adversary. And there's, of course, typically a great deal of consideration of whether the person can actually do the job they are being nominated for. Go figure. So that's how this normally works. That's how this should work. And then there's how Trump is doing it. And the people Donald Trump announced this week for key jobs could each, of course, fill their own tabloids for weeks with their own scandals. Some of those scandals alone should be disqualifying. And we're going to talk about those and why. But we also need to look beyond the grabby headlines, because these are people who could be sitting in the Situation Room in the Oval Office very, very soon. These are the people who will be advising the president on every crisis that crosses his desk and representing the United States, for some of them, overseas. And they're the people who have an impact also on your daily lives. See, these choices are, on the one hand, cartoonishly outrageous, but when that dust settles, it's not really just about the scandals and the personal lives of these nominees, and there are many. It's about what their positions and their lack of experience could do to our health system, our national security, and the rights we have in this country. So let's start with RFK Jr., shall we? Did RFK Jr. produce some of these strangest headlines in the history of presidential campaigns? He sure did. Does RFK Jr. have a strange, is one way of describing it, penchant for carrying dead animals in his car? He sure does. But RFK Jr. is also one of the most dangerous purveyors of inaccurate information about vaccines that our country has ever seen. The HHS secretary oversees the CDC, the NIH, and the FDA. So basically, in human terms, our vaccines, our medicine, and our food. His nomination and confirmation would mean that the guy who founded one of the nation's most prominent anti-vaccine groups would be in charge of the agency that makes recommendations on vaccines. The guy who said he would stop research into infectious diseases would be in charge of the agency that studies infectious diseases. So that's what's coming on that front. And then there's Matt Gaetz, Trump's pick to run the Justice Department. Is Matt Gaetz one of the most clownish members of Congress? Of course he is. Was he previously investigated over allegations of sex trafficking a 17-year-old girl? He was. And even though he was never charged, that alone should, of course, disqualify him for any cabinet position, especially, the top law enforcement job in the country. But if he gets confirmed, a guy who has spread conspiracy theories about January 6th and championed the cause of the rioters will oversee all January 6th cases. The guy who has said he is ready to abolish all three-letter agencies from the FBI to the ATF will be in charge of those very agencies. So that's what's coming, part of what's coming, if Matt Gaetz is Attorney General. And then there's Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence. Is Tulsi Gabbard prone to say things like Putin, Zelensky, and Biden should have ended the Ukraine war by using, quote, the aloha spirit? She is, and that's pretty odd. But Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, would mean an apologist for Vladimir Putin will oversee 18 intelligence organizations, including the CIA and the NSA. Means our allies would look at our intelligence services potentially and see someone at the top who has shown a greater fondness for dictators and our adversaries than our friends. And some of those allies will see someone they might think twice about sharing their own secrets with. We don't know. That's what's coming with Tulsi Gabbard atop our national intelligence services. And finally, there's Pete Hegseth, a veteran and a cable news host who has gone viral for axe-throwing mishaps and saying things like he can't remember washing his hands once over the last decade, which that is gross. But more recently, the headlines have revolved around a sexual assault allegation against him. And while he was never charged, his lawyer says he agreed to pay his accuser for a non-disclosure agreement. And yes, all of that, well, mainly the last piece, should be disqualifying on its own. But also consider the much bigger picture here again. His confirmation would mean someone who champions service members accused of war crimes would oversee our military. Someone who has said the military should not have women in combat roles will be in charge of lots of women in lots of combat roles. Secretary of Defense leads the largest organization in our government with millions of employees, including active service members, and a $900 billion budget. Their job is not at all to decide whether the military is woke or not, whatever that means. But that's what a Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, will see it as. So look, my point here is this. There's a lot of information coming at us fast and furious about all of these picks. Maybe Trump is testing his power over Republicans in the Senate by putting these people forward, maybe. Or maybe he thinks that Matt Gaetz and RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth are the best people for these jobs. Maybe he thinks that. Whatever the motivation, we can't just focus on the latest shocking headline. And that shouldn't be the only messaging, because it's easy to assume these personal scandals will prevent them from getting these jobs. But with this Republican Party, we just can't count on that. So it's important to understand what could be coming and, of course, how it could impact all of your lives. There's obviously a lot of soul searching right now going on within the Democratic Party, and that's a good thing. But what I worry about is that in the course of all that soul searching, some Democrats might reach the wrong sweeping conclusions. And there are a lot of issues that fall into that bucket. But one in particular that stuck out to me is transgender rights. Republicans spent hundreds of millions of dollars on anti-trans ads this election cycle, including one that showed Vice President Harris talking about government funding for gender-reaffirming care for prisoners and detainees. If that sounds like a particularly obscure issue, it is, because it applies to a tiny group of people. And it's also a policy that, by the way, was in place during the first Trump presidency. Another one of the lines that ran over and over again in those ads and throughout right-wing media is this idea that America is faced with a crisis of boys playing in girls' sports. Now, these ads created this perception that the issues of trans kids playing sports was dominating schools across the country, which is completely false. Some people got pulled into that argument. I mean, immediately after the election, Congressman Seth Moulton told the New York Times that, quote, Democrats spend way too much time trying not to offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that. And then last weekend, Congressman Moulton came on this network to discuss those comments.
I was just speaking authentically as a dad about one of many issues where I think we're just out of touch with the majority of voters. And I stand by my position. You know, maybe I didn't get all the words exactly right. But the point is that the backlash I've received proves my point that we can't even have these discussions as a party.
Look, reflection is good. But if that were actually an issue at thousands of schools across the country, it would be worthy of a debate. But there are just incredibly few examples of transgender girls playing in youth sports. And when we see those examples, there isn't evidence that these kids are a threat to safety or fairness. When I say few examples, I mean that if you were to count the examples of transgender girls playing youth sports in any single state, the number often rounds to 0. Take Utah. When a transgender athlete ban was passed there in 2022, there was a grand total of one transgender girl playing in youth sports. When South Dakota passed a ban, only 1 transgender girl had competed in high school sports since 2013. In fact, when these bans were making their way through Republican state houses in 2021, legislators in more than 20 states could not cite a single instance in their own state or region where a transgender athlete competing was a problem. And yet, the noise on this issue has been constant. And according to Donald Trump, that is on purpose.
It's amazing how strongly people feel about that. You see, I'm talking about cutting taxes. People go like that. Talk about transgender. Everyone goes crazy. Who would have thought 5 years ago you didn't know what the hell it was?
See, Donald Trump and Republicans have managed to amplify their bad faith attacks to the point that people do have concerns, as misguided and misinformed as those concerns may be. So this is a good time for Democrats to self-reflect about what went wrong and what to do better moving forward. Of course, it absolutely is. But during that process, it's important not to yield to manufactured panic and to align with the actual facts before making sweeping claims. echoing and adopting the panic from the other side is not leading. It's not meeting people where they are. It's simply falling prey to right-wing propaganda without checking the facts first.